When a franchise acquires a generational talent, the standard organizational response is straightforward. Protect the asset, build a supporting structure around her, and maintain an environment where she can perform at the highest level. What has been unfolding in Indiana follows a different pattern entirely. The tension visible on the sideline has moved beyond routine coaching friction into something that observers across the basketball community have characterized as a fundamental breakdown in the professional relationship between a player and her coaching staff. Physical confrontations, deliberate exclusion from post-game recognition, and a body language dynamic that speaks louder than any press conference statement. Taken together, these incidents are painting a troubling picture of an organization that does not know how to manage what it has. Footage that circulated in recent weeks produced an immediate and significant reaction from fans and analysts. Basketball is a contact sport by nature. Physical engagement is constant throughout any game, and coaches routinely use touch to direct players' attention during timeouts. But what was captured on video fell outside the ordinary range of that interaction. During a high-stress sequence, head coach Stephanie White was observed grabbing the star guard by the arm and pulling her aside with visible force. The player's response was immediate. Those close enough to observe, including lip readers who later reviewed the footage, noted that she demanded the coach remove her hands. The confrontation did not end there. Within the same sequence, an assistant coach performed a similar action, grabbing the guard by the arm and spinning her around during a heated huddle exchange. The reaction from the public was not measured disagreement. It was anger. Comments across platforms reflected a consistent position that physical contact of that nature, directed at a player by multiple members of a coaching staff, crosses a clear professional boundary regardless of the circumstances that prompted it. The sentiment that emerged most consistently from those watching was not simply that the incident was uncomfortable to observe. It was that such behavior should disqualify a coach from continuing in that role. Calls for Stephanie White's immediate removal were among the most prominent responses, and they were not isolated to fringe opinion. They represented a broad cross-section of the fan base, and they reflected a view that the conduct witnessed on that sideline was not correctable through internal conversation. It was, in the estimation of many who watched it, a termination-level failure of professional conduct. That reaction gains additional weight when the incident is placed in a wider context. The physical confrontation was not the first indicator that something had gone wrong between the coaching staff and the franchise player. It was, instead, the most visible evidence of a pattern that observers had been tracking for some time. The question that kept surfacing was direct. Why does this treatment appear to be reserved exclusively for the player at the center of this team's commercial and competitive identity? The behavior documented in those sideline clips, the grabbing, the spinning, the forceful redirection, has not been observed being applied to any other player on the roster. That asymmetry is not a minor detail. It is the central fact around which every other concern in this situation orbits. In professional sports, there are accepted norms around how coaches interact with players during high-pressure moments. Experienced coaches at the highest levels of both the men's and women's game understand that a franchise-caliber player, one who is responsible for the attention and revenue the team generates, commands a different kind of professional relationship than a depth player still establishing her role. That is not favoritism, it is organizational reality. When a player's presence is responsible for sellout crowds and a measurable increase in the franchise's economic profile, the dynamic between that player and the people managing her has to reflect an understanding of what she represents. The footage from Indiana suggested that no such understanding existed within the current coaching structure. The comparison that analysts and fans reached for most frequently was instructive. Across the landscape of professional basketball, in decades of documented sideline behavior, there is no comparable footage of a head coach physically grabbing a superstar-level player by the arm to redirect her during a game. The scenario is not simply rare. It is effectively non-existent as a feature of successful, high-functioning coaching relationships at the top of the sport. When that standard is applied to what occurred in Indiana, the gap between acceptable professional conduct and what was captured on video becomes difficult to minimize. Coaching authority in professional sports is real and necessary. Players at every level need structure, accountability, and direction. A coaching staff that lacks the ability to set expectations and hold players to them cannot function. But authority and physical coercion are not the same thing, and the ability to earn the trust and engagement of a player of this caliber through communication and demonstrated competence is a prerequisite for any coaching relationship that expects to succeed long-term. What was documented instead was a management approach that appeared to rely on physical dominance as a substitute for that trust. That is not a coaching philosophy, it is a failure of one. The sideline behavior and its aftermath became a lens through which earlier patterns of conduct were re-examined. Observers looking back at the season's trajectory began to note a consistent undercurrent. The coaching staff's relationship with the star guard had never appeared warm, but it had progressively become something more adversarial. What was described by multiple analysts as an old-school, rigid mentality within the organization suggested a staff attempting to impose a model of authority that predated the current era of the sport. The franchise has a history, and elements within its current leadership appear to be drawing on that history as a template. Not recognizing that the player they are applying it to exists in a different moment, with a different profile, and a different set of leverage points than any player this franchise has previously managed. The game has evolved substantially. The players it produces at the highest level are not simply athletes who happen to generate revenue for their organizations. They are, in many cases, the primary commercial engine of those organizations, the faces that drive media rights conversations, sponsorship structures, and ticket sales. Managing that kind of player with the methods appropriate to a different era is not discipline. It is a miscalculation about the nature of the relationship and, ultimately, about who holds leverage within it. The on-court evidence of that breakdown was visible beyond the isolated incidents of physical contact. Following a deep, contested three-pointer that energized the crowd, the star guard returned to the bench and completed a sequence of acknowledgments with teammates before walking directly past the coaching staff without eye contact. The gesture was not subtle. It was the behavior of a player who has separated herself psychologically from the authority structure, standing a few feet away. When a player stops playing for a system and begins playing despite it, the organizational cost is not limited to the relationship between two people. It shapes every competitive decision she makes on the floor, the risks she takes, the plays she trusts, and the degree to which she invests in the collective outcome versus the individual one. A coaching staff that has lost a player at that level of psychological engagement has lost something that cannot be recovered through tactical adjustment. The disconnection extended into formal media settings. At press conferences following significant performances, head coach Stephanie White was given direct opportunities to acknowledge the player's contributions, her resilience, her production under pressure, and the degree to which her presence had altered the competitive picture for the team. Those opportunities were not taken. In their place were generic statements about team effort and process that contained no specific acknowledgement of individual performance. For a player who had delivered what she delivered on the floor, the absence of that recognition was not a neutral act. It was a statement. And the public read it as one. When a head coach demonstrates a consistent inability or unwillingness to publicly credit her best player, the message communicated to that player, to her teammates, and to the watching public is not about modesty or collective emphasis. It is about the nature of the relationship and whether the coach views the player as someone to be lifted or managed down. The accumulated evidence, the sideline confrontations, the physical contact, the absence of public validation, created a portrait of a coaching approach oriented toward containment rather than development. That orientation, if the evidence reflects it accurately, represents a fundamental misunderstanding of what this player is and what she requires from the people charged with leading her. The conversation among fans and analysts shifted accordingly. Early in the season, the prevailing discussion concerned how the team could build around its primary talent and position itself for sustained competitive relevance. That conversation has been replaced by a different one. The question being asked now, broadly and without much dissent, is whether the current coaching structure is compatible with retaining the player who makes this franchise worth watching. The answer that has emerged from that discussion, across the fan communities most invested in the outcome, has been consistently negative. The calls for Stephanie White's dismissal were not fringe commentary from a small corner of the internet. They were among the most consistently expressed views across the platforms where this situation was being discussed. And the reasoning behind those calls was not abstract. It was grounded in specific documented behavior, the physical contact with a player, the pattern of public non-acknowledgement, and the visible deterioration of the relationship between the coaching staff and the player on whom the franchise's future depends. Fans who had purchased tickets and merchandise specifically to support the individual talent were not expressing impatience with a losing record. They were expressing a substantive concern that the organization was actively damaging something valuable, and doing so in ways that were visible, documented, and, critically, not being addressed. What makes this situation particularly significant is the timing. The player at its center is early in her professional career. The habits, associations, and organizational loyalties that form during these years carry long-term weight. A player who spends her formative professional seasons in an environment characterized by physical confrontations with coaches, deliberate exclusion from recognition, and a pervasive sense of being managed rather than supported is not simply enduring a rough patch. She is accumulating a set of experiences that will inform every organizational decision she makes when she eventually has the contractual freedom to make them freely. The franchise that treats her this way now is not simply creating present-day friction. It is building the case she will use when the time comes for why staying is not worth the cost. The economics of that outcome are clear. A player of this profile who departs a market in the early years of her career because the organizational environment was hostile takes with her the ticket revenue, the media attention, the sponsorship value, and the competitive credibility she represents. The franchise does not simply lose a player, it loses the version of itself that player made possible. That is a recoverable situation for some organizations under some circumstances. But it requires a recognition well in advance of the departure that something has gone wrong and a willingness to make the personnel decisions necessary to correct it. The evidence available suggests that the Indiana Fever are at a decision point. The coaching staff's conduct, as documented on sidelines and in press conferences over the course of recent weeks, has produced a reaction from the fan base that cannot reasonably be read as temporary or marginal. It is a sustained, specific, and increasingly urgent expression of concern from the people who make the franchise financially viable. That reaction centers on a clear position, that Stephanie White's management of the team's most important player has been inadequate, that the physical contact documented on video represents conduct that should not be tolerated at the professional level, and that the absence of meaningful corrective action from the organization is itself a problem that compounds the original one. The question of whether leadership acts on that signal or continues on the present course will determine far more than the outcome of the remaining games on this season's schedule. It will determine whether the franchise retains the talent around which its entire future has been constructed, or whether it becomes the organization that had something extraordinary and allowed it to leave.